Welcome to the EU Week. This event is presented by Estonian Business School. I have here my colleague Andreas Weisbach, who is the Research, Development, Innovation and Internationalization Head at Estonian Business School. And I'm Karmo Kroos, the R&D Development Officer. We'll be spending the upcoming academic hour or so talking about and discussing about the space and whether or not EU is falling behind the current ongoing space race. But before we get into those details, I'll ask Andreas to introduce himself more properly than I did, very briefly. Andreas has worked at EU on issues related to space, and we would be glad to learn a little bit more about your background before we get into the discussion topics.
So thank you very much, Karmo, and welcome from me as well. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not going to introduce myself for long. These are always very boring occasions. So by education and background, I'm actually a historian, but my link to space does mainly come through the European Union, particularly its Earth observation program, Copernicus, as well as the new space program that is currently ongoing. So during the time that I'm in Estonia, I am at the Estonian Business School, as you rightly say, but space remains close to my heart, and I try to keep an eye on what is happening. Plus, hopefully we'll be able to have an interesting discussion on everything surrounding it. So I look forward to it.
You definitely have plenty of expertise on it, so we look forward to hearing more about your opinions and views on the issues related to space exploration and space race. But to introduce the topic of space race, I thought it might be interesting for the online listeners and people present here to watch a short movie overview of the history of space race, which introduces us to the topic as such.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
4 months after John F. Kennedy was sworn into office, he promised that the United States would put a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. And on July 20th, 1969,
it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But why was landing a man on the moon so important? When Kennedy made that promise, the United States and the Soviet Union were at the height of the Cold War. A major front in that war was space, and putting a man on the moon, that would be the ultimate victory. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to orbit the Earth.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
1 month later, they launched Sputnik 2. The American press speculated that these launches gave Russia a military advantage in the Cold War. This marked the beginning of what would be known as the space race. Feeling pressure, the United States launched the Vanguard satellite in December, and after its launch rocket reached the height of a few feet, it burst into flames. Despite the slow start, by the end of 1958, Congress passed and President Eisenhower signed the 1958 Space Act, which created NASA. Both the US and the USSR created lunar exploration programs, each successfully launching moon flyby missions in 1959. But Russia led the space race. In September 1959, Luna 2 became the first spacecraft to reach the moon's surface. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. The U.S. was in dire need of a win in the space race, and it had to be something big. So President Kennedy asked Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson to look into what the U.S. could do to beat the Soviet Union. Put a laboratory in space? Orbit a man around the moon? Land a man on the moon? NASA's administrator, James E. Webb, said there was no way to beat the Soviets in building a space station. and the Soviets could probably send a man into the moon's orbit just as quickly. But maybe, just maybe, the US could be the first to land a man on the moon. On May 25, 1961, JFK publicly proposed that the US send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. The effort to land a man on the moon was christened the Apollo program, and Kennedy predicted its success would inspire people worldwide to choose American-style freedom over Soviet Allied tyranny. A few weeks later, Kennedy, ever the diplomat, met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and suggested the moon landing be a joint effort, but Khrushchev said no. The Soviets denied that they were trying to reach the moon, but they were. They built a moon suit prototype and designed a lunar module much like their American counterparts. Even though the Apollo program was launched in the spirit of competition, there were multiple efforts to defuse the space race for diplomatic reasons. In September of 1963, Kennedy even suggested that the US and Soviet Union could still work together on Project Apollo. But any prospect of cooperation ended when he was assassinated 2 months later. Apollo became a memorial to the fallen president, and the space race continued. Many firsts went to the Soviets. The USSR achieved the first long-duration spaceflight, the first multi-person spaceflight, and the first spacewalk. In 1966, Russia pulled off the first soft landing on the moon with Luna 9, but they still hadn't put a man on the moon. On July 20th, 1969, the United States did. Only 5 months before the deadline Kennedy had set at the beginning of the decade. On that day, the Apollo 11 mission landed 2 men, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, on the moon. They walked on the moon's surface for over 2 hours and were then brought safely back to Earth. The US had finally accomplished something big the Soviets had not, and set the stage for the future of space exploration.
Thank you. I hope it was informative, a brief overview of the space race, what took us here, where we are today. And I would like to ask from Andres, who's, as we learned, educated historian, what can we learn from the historical space race that was coined in the framework of the Cold War, what has led to the establishment of NASA and all the developments thereafter, what has it meant for the collapse of Soviet Union perhaps, or for the Russian Federation that has emerged.
So thank you, Harmo. This is more of a historical question, which can have a short answer and a very long answer. I will go for the short answer because the long answer might take hours. So first and foremost, I think, as the video also made very clear, it was really, so Soviet activities in space were of a great deal of worry to the Americans because, in essence, the Russians were ahead. So the first satellite in space, the Russians. The first animal in space, also the Russians. The first time flying past the moon, the Russians, and then you get Yuri Gagarin, then you get, her name was Tereshkova, I think, who was the first woman in space. In short, it was the Russians who had really ramped up their capacity. And then the Americans very clearly decided that they need to do something in this domain as well. But what it actually symbolizes for me is the importance of symbols. So of symbols, one, and of hope and of missions, two. Because during those days, today we talk about the threats of militarization and of space and so on. I don't think during those days this was actually really going to have too much of an impact in real terms on Earth. So it was very much about symbolism, about reputation, about hope, and also actually about having something to unite, I guess, a big project around which you could unite a society. So this is, so for me it was much more symbolic than it really was to do with any sort of economic substance. Two global superpowers, two very different ideologies, one going ahead, the other one feeling that they needed to keep up. But there is a long legacy to this. So you had this interest in space, which then sort of waned after the space race. You had the Apollo missions, but in the end, it sort of fell to the background, and space was largely out of the public imagination for a while. And it is only now, and primarily, I think, through the activities of dynamic entrepreneurs such as Elon Musk, the notion of going to Mars, launching a car into orbit, that I think space is beginning to captivate people's imagination again. As a legacy, what the Russians, or what the Soviets, and then also the Russians had, the capability of which has always been impressive in terms of space, is just the rocket capacity. So the ability to get stuff up and to get stuff high. And this obviously links not only to, intercontinental ballistic missiles, these are related to satellite launches, but even if you look at the legacy of that, when you see Russia's involvement with the European Space Agency, for instance, so this has now all been suspended after the invasion of Ukraine, but at the European spaceport in French Guiana, there is actually a separate launch pad specifically for Russian Soyuz rockets. Some of the satellites, be they for the Galileo program or for the Copernicus program, have actually been launched into orbit using Russian launches. There was a community of Russians living in French Guiana to work on the Soyuz launch pad and to supervise the launches. So launch capacity and rockets is something which the Soviets and then the Russians have always been pretty good at. Not to mention the fact that they're also quite cost effective. So if you're talking about the Cold War and its legacy, then I would say that is one of the biggest legacies, is just that particular niche, so launches into space. Is that comprehensive enough?
Well, that's quite comprehensive. There are several issues that I would like you to elaborate a bit more, but what I picked up from your answer, first of all and foremost, was that the great significance of symbolism to the sending first Sputnik and later on the Laika, and then Gagarin and Tereshkova to the space, and putting man on the moon, that there is a great symbolism related to the space exploration, and as well as the man's ability to explore what is out there, which actually united people both in the US and former Soviet Union. My question comes from is Europe and EU failing to take advantage of this uniting and symbolism that this represents? Or put it the other way, the symbolism, first of all, and the potential to unite Europe truly.
So space is actually, so the answer is no. I don't think Europe is failing to take advantage of this at all. I think it's actually rather the contrary. In the sense that the European Space Agency, which is an intergovernmental agency, in effect brings together most of the EU countries, plus several countries outside the EU, plus what is also quite little known is that I think Canada is also part of ESA. So the Europeans have actually, I think, used space very much to bring together the continent, be that through the European Space Agency, be that through the European Union, be that through a number of other agencies. I guess the Agency for EU Meteorological Satellites is another example that comes to mind. So internally, I think there's a great deal of cooperation around space issues in Europe, but also internationally, in the sense that the European Space Agency in particular has joint activities with NASA, with the Canadian Space Agency, with the Indians, with the Japanese. So space is a very logical area of cooperation, particularly space exploration, but also research and I guess the more scientific part of space. Because the costs are high, the benefit is not immediate and is not immediately divisible. in the sense that it's not I do this and I want this back. So it makes a lot of sense to pool resources, to pool competences, and to actually divide costs. So space has actually historically been quite benign in terms of cooperation. If you look at the International Space Station, where I think you have through the European Space Agency, you have something like 9 European countries. You have the Americans, you have the Russians, you have a few others. It's not really usually an area of great competition, in the sense that there's a lot to be gained through cooperation. And as strange as that may seem, that I think has largely been because of the lack of a sort of an immediate economic return. Where there is a clear economic return, because the space economy is vast. It's not just about exploration, it's about satellite navigation, it's about communication, it's about Earth observation, it's about lots of other things. But where there is an independent capacity to be gained, so take the GPS system, for instance, then there you have countries which have their own systems. So the Americans have GPS, the Europeans have Galileo, the Russians have GLONASS, the Chinese, I think, have Baidu, it's called. There you sort of keep the national sovereignty, because it's linked to all sorts of things, including defense and economic capabilities. But where there is no direct economic return, it makes eminent sense to cooperate, because there's not a great deal to lose, but you also pool your costs. And I would actually go even further, which is to say that for some of the programs, so Copernicus, the Earth observation program of the EU, is a very good example of this. It actually has a free, full, and open data policy, which means that in effect the data, which is tens of petabytes per year, is made available on a free and open basis to anyone around the world. There are some exceptions to this, but they're very few. So no is the short answer.
Well, we almost lost track what was the original question, but I somehow get the sense of you that Europe, in your opinion, has not failed in taking advantage that space offers in terms of uniting Europe, at least at the institutional level. Yet, and here I'm looking for your comment, is my reading correct that despite the institutional collaboration and the benefits that doing things together might offer because of the high cost and not immediate economic rewards, you don't have in Europe the perception that there is a space race out there, that we need to be better than Chinese, Americans, or Russians, that they might be lagging behind, and if so, that they are able to do things that we are not able to do, that it would have long-term benefits or consequences that,
So, to understand your question, you mean that we almost don't get the sense that there is a space race which is ongoing in Europe?
Yes, and partly, I guess, the historical introduction that the video showed was trying to tell the story that it drew a lot of public attention, this space race between US and USSR, the fact that the Soviets were able to do many things first that the Americans could not, and that the Apollo mission and putting men on the moon finally showed to the American public that they up to the competition. Something of a feeling, I think, is missing in Europe, that we are lagging behind in any of those terms, and we need to do more or
I understand.
Collaborate even more.
So I'm not actually clear that there really is a space race going on at the moment. So in the context of the Cold War, and I think the Soviet-American, in a way, competition at all levels, I think you had a relatively clearly defined objective. I mean, you saw President Kennedy, we need to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The rest, I think no, I haven't lost the microphone. So the first question we have to ask ourselves, is there really a space race on at the moment? If I had to give a very simplistic answer to that, I would actually probably say no. I don't think there is yet what I would call a consequential space race. I think all the things that we mentioned at the start, so the symbolism, the hope, if you look at China or India or other upcoming space nations, going into space, landing on the south pole of the moon for the Indians, these have a great deal of symbolic value. But I don't think there is really a space race going on, and at least not yet. And if you look at some of the more if we stick to exploration for a moment, so if we look at something like the Artemis mission, which is a program led by NASA related to human spaceflight, it basically has three main objectives before the end of the decade, which is one, to return humans to the moon before the end of the decade, establishing a base for sustainable lunar exploration, be that by humans or by or through robotics, but essentially doing something that's more permanent in nature, and also doing the tests needed for the future exploration of Mars. If you look at how that is planned, then it's led by NASA, but again, in collaboration with the European Space Agency, with JAXA, which is the Japanese space agency, the Canadian Space Agency, as well as private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and so on. So I think collaboration is still there, and there is a long list of different space projects where you have international collaboration. So I think my short answer to you would be that perhaps the communication and the advertisement of space and the role it plays in our everyday lives, because most people don't realize that, every time you use your credit card or take out money, the transaction is actually recorded through a space-based time synchronization system. Every time you order food or you order Uber or Bolt or whatever else, again, it's driven essentially by space-based assets. So the awareness may be not as great as it could be, but I'm not sure that there is something which I would call a dramatically hostile space race going on at the moment. So yes, of course, everybody's trying to develop their capabilities. I think recently in the news there was a story about some Russian wonder weapon which everybody was worried about in space. But I'm not sure that at the moment the space race is on. However, that being said, when you look at the projections for the development of the space economy over the next 10 years, for the public sector, it is likely to be dominated by defense concerns. That is very right. So be it for the protection of space assets, be it through enhanced intelligence capabilities, whatever else it happens to be, I think that is coming. But space is essentially a reflection of what happens on Earth. It's not, it's not things in itself per se. So how amicable or benign or aggressive relations are in that domain are almost always a direct reflection of what happens on Earth. But I don't think there is actually a full-on space race on yet. Even in my imagination, I don't think it yet exists.
Okay, if that is the case, perhaps you could share your thoughts why countries and large corporations find it worthwhile at all to spend on space programs. There probably would be other uses of that money in their national economies. What's in your understanding the driving force behind it, if it's not the competition with other countries, the military, economic, political side effects of it?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what you're saying is very realist in a certain way based on competition. But if I was to summarize why countries spend on space, I think it's research and development. I think it is economic potential. I think it is societal benefits. So for things like, I mean, let's take them one by one. So research and development, a lot of the stuff that's done cutting, it's a little bit like Formula One. So you have car manufacturers who go to Formula One, not because it's necessarily lucrative, but because they're testing all the technologies that they'd like to put into mainstream cars, in 5-10 years' time. It's quite similar with space, in the sense that, if you look at one of the biggest space companies in Europe, take Airbus, for instance, they are very, very involved in space. In fact, they have a division called Airbus Defence and Space. But they are at the same time a defense contractor, an aeronautics company, all sorts of other things. So I think technological development is very clearly one area. It's just research. The other area is just science. So Voyager 1 and 2, which are way off outside the solar system. It's not always driven by economics. It's also driven by understanding. Thirdly, it is economics. So at the moment, I was looking last night at the latest estimates of this. At the moment, the space economy is estimated, depends on whose estimates you believe, is valued at around 500 to 650 billion euros a year. That's quite sizable. That is set to grow to, I would say, about 1.5 to 2 trillion euros by 2035. So that's a 9% growth rate on an annual basis, which far exceeds GDP and is almost equivalent to the semiconductor industry, in effect. So the economic potential is also there. You then have space as an enabler for a host of other economic areas. So insurance, supply chains, finance, environmental monitoring, agriculture, transport, the list just goes on. So a lot of stuff that we do uses space-based assets without us actually necessarily realizing that we're using them. So the downstream sector and the downstream reliance is quite significant. But what it also does is that it allows the public sector and governments to make investments primarily in core infrastructure, or you can call it backbone or enablers, which can then be taken on by others to create economic value. So there's a very, very strong economic case. And of course, I don't want to overlook things like secure communications or defense aspects. They are there. And there is a rationale for them, but it's not the only one. And I think for quite a while, sort of defense-related areas were not the main driver of space. So it's extremely multidimensional. I don't think it's just about competition. There's a very strong research element, a very strong economic element.
Well, but if there are economic elements, what is the reason why taxpayers' money should be poured into it rather than private money? And isn't Europe behind in that respect? If you look what is going on and the news that are coming from the US.
I think there you are spot on. I think the main worry in Europe is not necessarily institutional. We can forever be comparing space-related budgets in the US and Europe and China. And, in this area, the US is in a way far in advance of everybody else. However, where I think there is a great deal of room for improvement for Europe is in private space companies. So given that at the moment, if you look at the space market, I would say that in terms of investment, there is probably a dominant role for the public sector. So just the investment into different assets and into space-related areas. If you, however, look at the revenues and the markets, I would say that this shifts. So I would say that from the space economy, probably about 75% of the total value pertains to commercial applications of the private sector, and 25% pertains to what you would call the public sector. And where Europe is lagging behind is private space companies. So the SpaceXs, the Planets, the Blue Origins, they're not Europe-based. It's a very difficult shift to make also. because the same applies to China. I mean, the private sector in terms of space in China is also pretty much non-existent. But if you look at the main sort of, I guess, economic and technological drivers of space, yes, there are several in terms of scientific achievements over the last 10 years, related to black holes and various other things, which are public related. But if you're really looking at what has happened in the space sector, all the main innovations have come from the private sector. Because in a certain way, what we're seeing is a democratization of space. The launch costs, so actually getting stuff up there, have come down, I would say, by a factor of about 10 in the last decade. So it's actually cheaper to get stuff up there. The cost of satellites, so what you're increasingly seeing is that these big sort of expensive public satellites are being replaced by relatively simple satellite constellations. Again, think Starlink or think Planet's Doves. So the cost has come down because you're going for larger constellation of cheaper, significantly lower per unit cost satellites. You are seeing that the combination of data fusion, data analysis, and artificial intelligence, nowadays it's become such a buzzword that I'm always careful to mention it. All of that has largely been driven by the private sector. Reusable rockets, SpaceX. I think it has, and it will further revolutionize the amount of stuff that you can actually get up there. And there Europe is lagging. I don't think we have a strong enough private sector in the space domain compared to the US. But we're not the only ones, neither does anyone else. It's a very American phenomenon in lots of ways.
The people here and listeners might not know that EBS is unique in that respect, that it's a private institution and is managing its own endowment and is investing into venture buildings, among which I have learned there is one that EBS has invested in satellite business. Would you like to clarify, as an example of the private sector initiative on that basis, or as an example, where is even a small country or relatively small enterprise can try to make money in space-related commercial activity?
So, if you look at a small country like Estonia, it makes no sense for us to have our own space program. Launching student satellites like we've been doing, absolutely, fine. It develops our future engineers. It helps to build the competence and the capacity. But there's no point really, I think, having a space program of our own. And that's where your previous question about the EU comes in. It actually allows smaller countries to join programs which would be, in effect, outside their reach if they weren't able to do it through organizations like ESA or the European Union. The short answer to your question is that it can either be in novel technological developments. So you have a number of companies in Estonia. Estonia is so small that a number of companies literally means 2 or 3, who are actually involved in space technology, be that human life support systems in outer space. So these are really things related to materials and to, I guess, tangible technical innovation. But I think most of the potential actually comes from downstream services and what you can do with space data.
What you can do with
space data. And here, in a way, the system that we have in Europe is a very good example. You link it to EBS in a certain way. The company that we're collaborating with is largely using the open data provided by the EU satellite system. From that data, they are building a number of applications which can be used, by different users across. I think they're mainly in the agriculture and forestry sector. And what you can do there is basically build a business model on the basis of one or several data sources to translate the data that comes from space in a manner that's actually useful to the end users. Because if you're a farmer, or if you're a forest owner, or if you're an insurance broker or whatever else, I mean, what will you know about space data? The answer is not very much. So the notion of having these technically capable translators between what space provides and between what is actually useful to the end user, I see as a major opportunity. Because it doesn't require these multi-million, sometimes even multi-billion investments into hard space infrastructure. So that, I guess, is the sort of short answer to your question.
Well, we're curious to learn more in the future how this company is doing and how the money is made in space.
The money is made on Earth. It is not made in space. It's this, I think, is so. You know, again, when you're looking outwards and you hear stories about asteroid mining and lunar resources and various. You can look outwards, i.e., where you can go in terms of space, or you can look at what space can do for us here on Earth. And at the moment, overwhelmingly, no, sorry, I would say almost exclusively, the net economic benefit comes from what space assets are able to deliver in terms of benefits on Earth. So literally, these are the GPSs, these are the satellite communication systems, this is the Earth observation imagery, this is all the services linked to it. One day we may get to a point where we're actually able to, through resource extraction or lunar colonies or things like that, actually make them fully economically viable. Also in outer space. But the reason why there is so much activity by the public sector there, in collaboration, but often with the private sector, is that the risk is just too high. Which means also that if you look at the investors, the private investors who are involved in space, I mean, of course, they're looking at the economic case, but my suspicion is that it is not their only concern. It's literally a bit like the same imagination, the hope, the being the sort of innovative avant-garde of the future, rather than, you know, I invest my $1 and I'd like 3 back, because it may take a very, very long time for that money to come back.
I'm curious to learn what you think we could learn from the internet economy, big tech, and all of that, and the taxation issue that has emerged in Europe because of that you have in economy, or in the sector of the economy that is dominated by e-commerce, possibility to make money in one country, but be taxed in another. And I guess that's probably even more the case when it comes to the space and opportunities of transferring costs into one place and being taxed in a selected country. On the other hand, that is there a need for learn from this what happened in e-commerce and internet business, big tech, so that it could be, or we could start thinking about those issues already? Is there a need for better regulation and role for the international cooperation in that respect?
So, I mean, I guess you're really asking 2 questions here. One is related to everything to do with tax domiciliation and what we can learn from e-commerce. The other one is the regulatory framework for space-related activities as a whole. So what concerns taxation? I don't think that for the time being, space is really very different to any other sector of the economy. Because the legal entities, or those who have to pay taxes, they're still registered on Earth. They still have their incorporation somewhere in some country. in the sense that we don't yet have a colony on the moon which is self-sufficient, not just in terms of, survival and reusing resources and various other things, but also its own taxation system. So I think we are still not quite there. So the answer is, I'm not really sure that here the space sector is particularly different to any other sector.
But isn't that true that there is quite a bit of trash out there, and sooner or later an issue would come, who would be responsible to taking care of this trash which is in the space, and that there might be cost related to it. These private satellites which abandon that, other elements of trash.
Absolutely.
And this cost will be generated and will be sent, concentrated somewhere. Yet the money which was made is somewhere else, perhaps.
So, okay, I guess that's the second part of the question. So this is not so much related to taxation, but more related to liability. So there is, trash is, let's call it space debris. That's what it's literally called. So NASA, I think, estimates that at the moment there's about 9,000, 10,000, I can't remember the exact figure, but 9 or 10,000 tons of debris around Earth's orbit. And this is composed of about 100 million different pieces of debris. Some of them tiny, some of them slightly bigger, but all, of course, are moving at a relatively high speed, meaning that if they hit something, then the impact can be quite damaging. What we have also seen with these large constellations that I was mentioning, so not just the big chunky satellites that go up, but literally, constellations of tens, hundreds, thousands of satellites. We have seen a dramatic increase in the number of satellites now launched into orbit. So I think that in the first half of 2022, there was something like 1,000 or even more different satellites put into orbit. To answer your question, I think that there will most likely have to be some regulation around in-orbit activities. A lot of, again, it depends, of course, on whose programs they are and who sets the criteria, but having the requirements for deorbiting or retiring satellites at the end of their lifetime is already a requirement in a number of places in Europe. I know that ESA certainly deals with it. I also know that there are a number of initiatives which are what are called cleanup initiatives, to see how we can use the technological innovation to basically clear the orbit a bit. So that definitely is an issue. So there is the whole aspect of regulating activities around the space. Most outer space-related regulation is very old. Well, very old. It dates from the UN frameworks, from 50 years ago or so. A lot of the responsibility is put on the launching country, so the country from which the launch takes place. So if it's India, it's India. If it happens from France or French Guiana, it's from there.
Kazakhstan is a big.
You would imagine, no? It's a so I think that there is very definitely a need to take a critical look at the regulation governing not just in-orbit activities, but also other areas of space. Ideally, this would actually also, strengthen commitments around the peaceful use of space and various other things, just looking to the future. The question, of course, is who would develop it? So at the moment, the framework is essentially a United Nations framework. Who would enforce it? And how it would be enforced? It's not an easy question to answer, but your point in general is right. I think that at a national level, we have seen a proliferation now of space agencies and space actors. In the past, space was expensive. It was there for the US, it was there for the Soviet Union, then for Russia, it was there for Europe. You had these were basically the dominant actors. And now, in addition to China, Japan, India, Canada, all the aforementioned actors, you have Thailand, you have Peru, you have, I think, a total of somewhere between 80 and 90 space agencies in different countries now. So there is this proliferation of interest, and the number of companies in space-related domains, again, these are not my estimates, I've just sort of, I'm just referring to other studies. I think there are something like 10,000 companies trying to engage in space-related aspects, not always up in orbit. But yes, in my view, there is a need to regulate, but regulation ex ante, or before there is a dramatic need for it, is always more difficult than ex post, meaning, you know, when there's no point setting a set of regulations for a lunar colony before, you know, you actually know what you're regulating.
But debris or trash out there, I mean, somebody has, you know, has to clean it up, somebody will have the cost of it, and if you are not collecting tax money to do it, then that's my, you know, the relation to the taxation issue that I tried to point out. If it is such a global problem, and the you know, benefits are concentrated, but the negative side effects are not, then...
Well, it's so and so, in the sense that you could argue about the question. So I'll put it to you another way. Every country or company or continent who is active in space is at a risk of this debris. So all the players have the risk. So the risk in a certain way is a common risk to everybody, which should in principle also make it easier to find a common solution, simply because, you know, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not I take the benefit, you take the cost. Of course, I'm not going to do anything about it. It's more the fact that we are all threatened by this, therefore we should do something. And as I say, there are a number of initiatives underway to do this. There are a number of initiatives to prevent it, primarily through, you know, the end of life or deorbiting mechanisms of satellites. But I don't think this has been so prominent a problem yet, that somebody has, you know, stood up and said that in the UN or wherever else that we are now developing this, because getting consensus around this will not be easy, as in all multilateral organizations. But it's not just a benefit here, cost here. It's actually a risk that I think is quite universal to all space actors. So, yeah.
Well, I would like to devote the remaining 10 or 12 minutes for the future, to learn and to ask and learn from you what you think the future will hold for the Europe when it comes to space, and countries like Estonia within the Europe. Oof.
So firstly, the space sector will grow. This is clear. And just in a way, because it's, you know, if we're just having a chat, it's difficult to conceptualize it, but it's important to understand what the space economy or the space sector actually is. There is a very clear, I mean, there are overlaps in the same actors, but you can divide the space economy up into essentially infrastructure. You know, think satellites, think launches, think basically the hard stuff. Then into services, which are basically dominated by satellite navigation, satellite communication systems, Earth observation. You then have space-enabled services, so this is all the agricultures, the insurances, and the rest. You then have space exploration, which is really usually of a more scientific nature. You then have human space flight, so this is everything from space tourism to, you know, collaborative arrangements such as the International Space Station. You then have space resources, so this is everything to do with asteroid mineral extraction and lunar resources. And then you have what I would call the support functions to it. So this is all the legal aspects, this is insurance, this is the financing related to it. So it's not a monodimensional sector. There is very clearly the upstream, the midstream, the downstream, and then everything that is around it. So as I say, I think the space economy is likely to triple overall in the next 10 years or so, which is a massive growth. I think that the greatest commercial potential will be in the downstream services. In the public sector, here Europe is in a bit of a dilemma, because most analysts think that the biggest public sector role in space will be related to defense and to sort of what I would call societal services, environmental monitoring, humanitarian relief, disaster response, things like these. But there, of course, as we're seeing all over the place at the moment, is that issues related primarily to defense are still very much national in Europe. They're not really in the competence of the EU fully. They are not in the competence of the European Space Agency, which is a civil space agency. So I think that space, like everything else, will be part of this greater debate about what the future of Europe is in this respect. What else? I think that Europe really needs to develop its private space economy. I think the main advantage that we have there is the fact that a lot of the growth will come from downstream and will come from data and service-related elements where we should be competitive. But we suffer from the same stuff as always, bigger venture capital market in the US than in Europe. A single bigger market in the US than in Europe, which is still at times fragmented between the different member states of the EU. More entrepreneurial spirit, more risk taking, more. It's not just space. This is the main. This is what we always talk about when we talk about the difference between the US and the EU. But I think the role for smaller countries like Estonia certainly will be to find their niche in this bigger space value chain, plus to develop services on the basis of data generated by space programs which come from outside Estonia. My own vision in a certain way is to have this fully integrated data and communications ability, where you're able to fuse different types of data from different satellites, where you're able to add those to local data, be that from drones, planes, whatever else, where you actually have a capability to almost in real time monitor what is happening on Earth. We're not there yet, for a number of reasons. I think standardization and harmonization of all these different data sources becomes very, very important. But I'm not sure whether the commercial stimulus to do that will be there, because everybody wants to build their own platform. so it might be a bit difficult. But for smaller countries and smaller companies, build on data.
Okay, I wonder how you envision the space development or development of space industry and things related to it, even if it's not a race, to play out for less developed countries, and how to avoid perhaps the further development of inequalities between developed and or developing countries.
Honestly, I think the answer here is exactly the same as it is for everything related to innovation and to technological innovation in particular. The same question you could extend to Internet of Things, to AI, to every major technological development. I don't know the answer to this question. I think that there is very clearly an element of space which ought to be a public good in a certain way. I think Europe is trying to make great strides in that direction, but as the geopolitical competition intensifies, it remains to be seen exactly what happens there. But I think that Europe has been at the forefront of making the data that its programs generate available on a free and open basis for use everywhere. I don't know what the future will hold in that regard. But in the end, given that these sectors are know-how and skill intensive, like most problems related to inequality and related to, I guess, the sort of difference of opportunities in different places, it often boils down to education. But the problem with education is that it is always a long-term solution because, it takes generational changes and it takes decades to develop something. And nowadays I notice that people are increasingly looking for very short-term solutions. I have a problem and I would like it solved in 3 days. Well, this is not a problem that's going to be solved for 3 days, but it's not unique to space. It's, I think it's the same in all the high-tech areas. And like everybody else, I don't know the exact answer to this.
Well, that's almost a good place to end the discussion, or maybe there are issues that I did not tackle or address. Is there something we should have been addressing that I missed, that you would like to raise before we call it a day?
The answer is no, probably not. I think that this issue between private and public collaboration is extremely important. And there is a certain natural division of responsibilities there. So when we're talking about environmental monitoring, when we're talking about defense, when we're talking about emergencies, natural events, all the rest, that is a natural scope of the public sector. All the more commercial activities are the natural scope of the private sector. But the way in which this line between public and private evolves in space, I think, will be defining. Not only in terms of what the economics of space looks like, but also what the governance of space will look like. So that, I think, is the first thing. And the second thing is much, much more forward-looking, which is to actually try to conceptualize what would human existence look like extra Earth. So it comes back a little bit to your governance system. But imagine that you do have a self-sufficient lunar colony. Imagine that you do at the start have, a few hundred people, or 400, 500, whatever it happens to be there. Imagine this colony grows. What is that then? Under whose jurisdiction does it fall? How does it govern itself? Is there a link? I mean, it's just one of the beauties of this issue is that it spurs the imagination a bit. And the next question, of course, is, does it offer an opportunity for a utopian or a dystopian view? Could it be, in a certain way, the possibility to avoid, all the mistakes that have at one point or other been made on Earth? Or is this just, a setup for a how should I say, a dystopian, in the end, will it bring out the best or the worst in humanity? I guess that's where I want to get to. And these are two very different questions, private versus public in the near future, and the future of humanity in the longer term. And space offers, scope to look at both, so it's fascinating.
Well, at that bombshell, it's a good place and to end the discussion. I hope that the listeners and followers had an interesting hour with us, and you learned something from Andres, who has a wealth of experience working in the industry at the regulatory level, and we will be looking forward to what the future will hold for us all.
So thank you very much, Karmo. It has been a great pleasure as always.